Welcome to Tea and Clues, where every story unfolds like a warm cup of tea with a dash of mystery. Step into a world of gentle detective tales, charming villages, and clever puzzles waiting to be solved. Whether it's a quiet afternoon mystery or a cozy crime to unravel, each story is crafted to intrigue and delight, without the dark, chilling twists of traditional crime stories. What you'll find here: light-hearted yet engaging detective stories, charming villages with hidden secrets, a mix of cozy noir and classic mystery vibes. Stories perfect for relaxing and unwinding. So grab your favorite cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let's uncover clues together, because every mystery deserves a little warmth. Subscribe and join the Tea and Clues Mystery Club today. Chapter 1, The Summer Fete in St. Mary Mead, had begun in the most delightful manner, as it always did. The village green was a picture of rural charm, with colorful bunting strung between the chestnut trees, their broad leaves offering respite from the summer sun. Stalls lined the edges of the green, tables neatly set with displays of homemade jams, hand-knitted scarves, and fresh-baked goods. The scent of warm pastries and lavender mingled in the air, carried on a gentle afternoon breeze. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably at a shaded table near the refreshment stand, observed the festivities with quiet amusement. She had always enjoyed the fete, not for its merriment, but for the peculiar social dynamics it revealed. It was an occasion where one could observe the interplay of personalities, the ladies of the Women's Institute fussing over their baking, competition entries, young George Phelps, the postmaster's son, sneaking an extra scone when his mother wasn't looking, the vicar's wife, glancing pointedly at Mrs. Weatherby's rather heavy-looking fruitcake, debating whether charity ought to outweigh personal taste. Miss Marple had already sampled Mrs. Bantry's lemon curd tart, delightful with a delicate crispness to the crust, and, with years of practiced diplomacy, politely avoided Mrs. Weatherby's fruitcake. Experience had taught her that avoiding an unpalatable dish could be done with the right mixture of graciousness and distraction. The main event was the raffle, where Mr. Harold Symington, the village solicitor, was overseeing the drawing of names. He was a well-regarded man, efficient, dependable, though not particularly warm. Beside him stood Mrs. Eleanor Marsh, an elegant woman who had recently moved into Lilac House, a cottage at the edge of the village. Mrs. Marsh had been the subject of much village curiosity since her arrival. She had introduced herself as a widow, hoping to settle into a quieter life. But Miss Marple had observed a distinct nervousness about her. Her smile, though practiced, did not quite reach her eyes, and her responses to casual questions about her late husband, about why she had chosen St. Mary Mead, were always just a bit too careful, too measured. At the moment, Mrs. Marsh was exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Bantry, though Miss Marple noted the way her fingers lightly gripped the edge of her scarf, twisting the fabric. A sign of tension. "Eleanor, dear, do come here a moment," Mrs. Bantry called, waving her over to the baking stall. Mrs. Marsh hesitated for the briefest of moments before smoothing her expression and moving gracefully toward her friend. Miss Marple took another sip of her tea. Yes, there was something there. The fete carried on in good spirits. Children chased each other near the hedgerow, their laughter ringing across the green. The raffle prizes, a fine bottle of sherry, a selection of gardening tools, a luxurious woolen blanket, were being announced, and polite applause followed each winner. Then came the scream. It cut through the pleasant chatter, silencing the crowd. In an instant, heads turned sharply toward the hedgerow bordering the green. A murmur of unease rippled through the villagers, as people hurried toward the source of the commotion. Miss Marple, moving with measured but unerring purpose, followed. What they found was Mr. Harold Symington, slumped against the trunk of an old elm tree, his face an unnatural shade of ashen gray. His hand clutched weakly at his throat, his breathing labored, his eyes wide with distress. Dr. Haydock, who had been enjoying a quiet afternoon cup of tea, pushed through the gathering crowd and immediately knelt beside the stricken man. "Stand back! Give him air!" he barked, swiftly loosening Symington's tie and checking his pulse. His experienced hands moved efficiently, but his frown deepened as he examined the solicitor's pale, sweating face. Miss Marple's keen eyes swept the ground. Near Symington's feet lay a half-eaten piece of cake, its golden crumbs scattered on the grass. An overturned paper cup of lemonade, the contents seeping into the earth. The scent of lemon and sugar lingered in the air, deceptively innocent. Dr. Haydock pressed, his fingers against Symington's wrist again, his mouth tightening. Then, after a moment, he turned to Inspector Graves, who had arrived with Constable Reed in tow. "I don't like the look of this," Haydock muttered. "His pulse is weak, his breathing's irregular. I'll need to examine him properly, but I suspect poison." A collective gasp ran through the crowd. Symington struggled to speak, his voice a rasp of effort. "My—" His fingers twitched. Then, with a shuddering breath, he slumped forward, unconscious. Dr. Haydock acted quickly, calling for assistance as he began treatment, but the unease among the villagers had already taken hold. Miss Marple remained silent, watching the faces of those around her. Panic and fear were predictable, but guilt, discomfort, or too careful neutrality? That was where one found the real clues. Mrs. Marsh, who had been chatting so pleasantly moments before, had gone rigid, her gloved hands clutching the folds of her skirt. Mrs. Bantry was whispering furiously to her husband. The vicar's wife looked as though she might faint. And near the refreshment stall, one particular figure remained curiously unreadable. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. It was a most interesting reaction. Inspector Graves straightened. "Right. Nobody leaves the green until we've spoken to everyone." Miss Marple, still calm amid the growing tension, gave a small nod. The thread of suspicion had begun to unravel, and as she looked again at the crumbs of cake and the spilled lemonade, she had a distinct feeling that the clues were already right in front of them. Chapter 2. The villagers of St. Mary Mead were not accustomed to scandal, let alone poisonings. Whispers spread quickly across the green as Inspector Graves and his constables secured the area. The summer fete, once filled with laughter and the scent of fresh pastries, had turned into something far graver. Mr. Harold Symington, the village solicitor, remained unconscious, his shallow breaths the only sign of life. Dr. Haydock, kneeling beside him, kept his movements brisk and methodical, his concern evident but restrained. Miss Jane Marple, standing just beyond the gathering crowd, observed everything. The true clues in an event such as this were not found only in the victim, but in the reactions of those around him. Mrs. Eleanor Marsh, standing a short distance away, still clutched the folds of her dress. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes flickered nervously over the scene as though calculating something. Mrs. Bantry, though ever the social butterfly, was unusually quiet. She was whispering rapidly to her husband, Colonel Bantry, who kept rubbing his chin with uneasy curiosity. Miss Weatherby, still stationed at the baking table, had gone deathly pale. And then there was the young maid from the Blue Boar Inn, Sally Finch, shifting anxiously from foot to foot, her gaze darting between the lemonade stall and the unconscious man. Miss Marple filed each reaction away carefully. Inspector Graves, his authority solidifying in the presence of a crime, addressed the crowd. "No one leaves until we've spoken. To you." His tone was sharp, but controlled. "Mr. Symington was poisoned. Dr. Haydock suspects something was added to his drink or food. We will be collecting statements." A new ripple of alarm went through the villagers. "Poison?" Mrs. Bantry gasped. "What an utterly dreadful thing," muttered the vicar's wife, clutching at her hat. Mrs. Weatherby, still ashen, swayed slightly. "It wasn't from the cakes, was it?" Inspector Graves's sharp gaze settled on the refreshments table, where the remnants of Symington's half-eaten slice of cake and overturned cup of lemonade remained. "What was, served here?" Miss Weatherby swallowed hard. "The usual fare: cakes, pastries, scones, and homemade lemonade." Graves turned to Sally Finch, the young maid who had been helping serve drinks. "Who poured Mr. Symington's lemonade?" Sally's eyes widened. I don't know for sure, sir. He took the cup himself, I think. Or maybe Mrs. Marsh handed it to him." At the sound of her name, Eleanor Marsh's head snapped up. "What?" Graves faced her. "Mrs. Marsh, did you serve Mr. Symington his lemonade?" Eleanor's lips parted, and for the briefest moment, hesitation crossed her face. Then she shook her head. "No, I don't recall doing so." Graves's eyes narrowed. "You don't recall? Or you didn't?" Eleanor straightened, her composure returning. "I didn't," she said firmly. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the slight tremor in her voice. Graves turned back to Sally. "You saw her near the refreshments table?" Sally nodded, her hands twisting in her apron. "Yes, sir. She was talking to Mr. Symington just before he took his drink. But I don't know if she gave it to him." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "And who baked the cake?" Miss Weatherby swallowed hard. "It was—" She hesitated, then exhaled. "Mrs. Marsh's cake." The entire crowd fell silent. Eleanor Marsh took a sharp breath, her expression tightening. "That's ridiculous," she said swiftly. "Half the village ate that cake. Are you suggesting I poisoned everyone?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not at all, my dear, but perhaps only one piece was tampered with." Inspector Graves looked at Eleanor with renewed suspicion. "You prepared the cake yourself?" Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "I did, but I hardly see how that makes me a suspect." Graves studied her. "You were the last person seen with Symington before he drank his lemonade, and now we know the cake came from you." Miss Marple, sensing the tension in the air, intervened smoothly. "Perhaps we should take a step back, Inspector." She turned toward Mrs. Weatherby. "Did you see Mrs. Marsh place the cake on the audiobooks table?" Mrs. Weatherby's hands fidgeted in her apron. "No, I was busy arranging the other cakes." Miss Marple nodded. "Then it is quite possible that someone else had access to it before it was served." Eleanor exhaled sharply. "This is absurd." "I had no reason to harm Mr. Symington." Graves raised an eyebrow. "Didn't you?" Eleanor's expression flickered. "What do you mean?" Graves held up his notebook. "We'll get to that in due time, Mrs. Marsh." Miss Marple took a slow sip of her tea before setting it down. "Perhaps, Inspector, we ought to consider what Mr. Symington was working on." "Recently?" Graves hesitated, then pulled out a small notebook. "He was the village solicitor. Wills, property matters, legal disputes." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And had he been dealing with anything particularly sensitive?" Graves flipped a page, then frowned. "Yes, He had been handling an estate claim, one that was recently contested. Eleanor's body went rigid. Miss Marple tilted her head. Ah, now that is interesting. Graves closed the notebook with deliberation. We'll be having a long talk, Mrs. Marsh. Eleanor Marsh's breath hitched, but she quickly masked it. I have nothing to hide. Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap, gave a small, knowing smile. Of course not, my dear. Of course not. And yet, the first true thread of suspicion had just been woven into the case. Chapter 3. The sun had begun to dip behind the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green. Where only hours ago laughter and polite conversation had filled the air, now a heavy stillness had settled over the fete. The stalls, once bustling with eager villagers, stood half abandoned. The cakes, jams, and craftwork remained untouched, their sellers too preoccupied with the shock of the day's events. Mr. Harold Symington had been taken away by Dr. Haydock and a few strong young men to his home where the doctor could keep him under close observation. Though still unconscious, his condition had stabilized, confirming the grim suspicion that he had been deliberately poisoned. Miss Jane Marple, standing near the refreshments table, quietly observed as Inspector Graves questioned the villagers in his usual brusque manner. You were seen near the lemonade. Mrs. Marsh, Graves repeated, his sharp eyes fixed on Eleanor Marsh, who stood with her arms folded tightly over her chest. Mrs. Marsh, despite the rising tension, remained composed. Her expression was cool, but Miss Marple did not miss the way her fingers subtly clenched the fabric of her skirt. Yes, I was near the table, Eleanor admitted, her voice steady. But so were many others. I did not hand Mr. Symington his drink. Graves pursed his lips, flipping through his notebook. And yet, the cake he ate, your cake, is one of the last things he consumed before collapsing. A murmur of concern rippled through the gathered villagers. Mrs. Weatherby, who had earlier confirmed the cake belonged to Eleanor, shifted uncomfortably. Miss Bantry, always eager for intrigue, leaned closer to Miss Marple and whispered, Do you think she did it, Jane? She looks rather pale. Miss Marple's lips twitched ever so slightly. Paleness, my dear, is not necessarily an indicator of guilt. Shock will do just as well. Graves exhaled sharply. Mrs. Marsh, were you aware that Mr. Symington was handling a disputed estate case? At this, Eleanor's posture stiffened. The other villagers leaned in slightly. Curiosity piqued. Eleanor inhaled, her hands tightening at her sides. I knew he was a solicitor, but I don't see what that has to do with me. Graves tilted his head slightly, watching her reaction. It has quite a bit to do with you, Mrs. Marsh, because I have reason to believe the case involved a property inheritance. Miss Marple noted how a shadow passed over Eleanor's face, just for an instant. A flicker of something. Fear? Resignation? Mrs. Bantry, standing beside Miss Marple, grasped her arm excitedly. Oh, do you think she— Miss Marple gave her a soft pat on the hand. Patience, dear. Eleanor lifted her chin. If you are suggesting that I had something to gain from Mr. Symington's work, I assure you, you are mistaken. Graves studied her for a moment before flipping a page in his notebook. Then you won't mind answering a few more questions at the station. A hush fell over the villagers. Mrs. Marsh's fingers twitched at her sides, but she quickly schooled her expression. I will, of course, cooperate in any way necessary, but I think it's absurd to suggest I had any motive to harm Mr. Symington. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but pointed. Motive is such a curious thing, Mrs. Marsh. It often isn't about what one stands to gain, but rather what one stands to lose. Eleanor's gaze flickered toward Miss Marple, her lips pressing together. Graves straightened. "Constable Reed, escort Mrs. Marsh to the station." Constable Reed, a tall but nervous-looking young man, hesitated before nodding and stepping forward. "This way, ma'am." Eleanor took a steadying breath before walking past the gathered villagers with a calm dignity that, Miss Marple noted, seemed just a touch too practiced. As soon as she was gone, the murmurs erupted. "Imagine! Poison at the summer fete!" gasped Miss Hartnell, clutching at her pearls. "And a newcomer, no less," muttered Colonel Bantry. "Never liked her much. Too secretive by half." Miss Marple simply listened. After a moment, Inspector Graves approached, shaking his head. "I don't trust her." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "I wouldn't be too hasty, Inspector. The guilty are not always so obvious." Graves sighed. "She had access to the cake, was seen near the lemonade, and seems to be involved in some sort of legal dispute with the very man who was poisoned." "That sounds rather damning to me." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, and yet—" Graves frowned. "And yet?" Miss Marple gestured toward the refreshments table, where the untouched cakes and drinks still remained. "It is a very public place to commit a murder, don't you think?" Graves scowled. "Poison doesn't require a close encounter. It could have been slipped in hours earlier." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Then, perhaps, we should find out who had access before the fete began." Graves tapped his notebook against his palm. "You mean—" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Yes, Inspector. If Mrs. Marsh were being framed, wouldn't it be sensible to consider who might have made it seem as though she was guilty?" A new silence settled between them. Graves, ever the practical investigator, let out a reluctant sigh. "I suppose that means more questioning?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, yes, Inspector. And I do believe you will find some rather interesting answers." She turned her gaze back toward the half-eaten cake and the spilled lemonade. Yes, she thought, the real culprit was hiding in plain sight. Chapter 3. The sun had begun to dip behind the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green. Where only hours ago laughter and polite conversation had filled the air, now a heavy stillness had settled over the fete. The stalls, once bustling with eager villagers, stood half-abandoned. The cakes, jams, and craftwork remained untouched, their sellers too preoccupied with the shock of the day's events. Mr. Harold Symington had been taken away by Dr. Haydock and a few strong young men to his home where the doctor could keep him under close observation. Though still unconscious, his condition had stabilized, confirming the grim suspicion that he had been deliberately poisoned. Miss Jane Marple, standing near the refreshments table, quietly observed as Inspector Graves questioned the villagers in his usual brusque manner. "You were seen near the lemonade." "Mrs. Marsh," Graves repeated, his sharp eyes fixed on Eleanor Marsh, who stood with her arms folded tightly over her chest. Mrs. Marsh, despite the rising tension, remained composed. Her expression was cool, but Miss Marple did not miss the way her fingers subtly clenched the fabric of her skirt. "Yes, I was near the table," Eleanor admitted, her voice steady. "But so were many others. I did not hand Mr. Symington his drink." Graves pursed his lips, flipping through his notebook. "And yet, the cake he ate, your cake, is one of the last things he consumed before collapsing." A murmur of concern rippled through the gathered villagers. Mrs. Weatherby, who had earlier confirmed the cake belonged to Eleanor, shifted uncomfortably. Miss Bantry, always eager for intrigue, leaned closer to Miss Marple and whispered, "Do you think she did it, Jane? She looks rather pale." Miss Marple's lips twitched ever so slightly. "Paleness, my dear, is not necessarily an indicator of guilt. Shock will do just as well." Graves exhaled sharply. "Mrs. Marsh, were you aware that Mr. Symington was handling a disputed estate case?" At this, Eleanor's posture stiffened. The other villagers leaned in slightly. Curiosity piqued. Eleanor inhaled, her hands tightening at her sides. I knew he was a solicitor, but I don't see what that has to do with me." Graves tilted his head slightly, watching her reaction. "It has quite a bit to do with you, Mrs. Marsh, because I have reason to believe the case involved a property inheritance." Miss Marple noted how a shadow passed over Eleanor's face, just for an instant. A flicker of something. Fear? Resignation? Mrs. Bantry, standing beside Miss Marple, grasped her arm excitedly. "Oh, do you think she—" Miss Marple gave her a soft pat on the hand. "Patience, dear." Eleanor lifted her chin. "If you are suggesting that I had something to gain from Mr. Symington's work, I assure you, you are mistaken." Graves studied her for a moment before flipping a page in his notebook. "Then you won't mind answering a few more questions at the station?" A hush fell over the villagers. Mrs. Marsh's fingers twitched at her sides, but she quickly schooled her expression. "I will, of course, cooperate in any way necessary, but I think it's absurd to suggest I had any motive to harm Mr. Symington." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but pointed. "Motive is such a curious thing, Mrs. Marsh. It often isn't about what one stands to gain, but rather what one stands to lose." Eleanor's gaze flickered toward Miss Marple, her lips pressing together. Graves straightened. "Constable Reed, escort Mrs. Marsh to the station." Constable Reed, a tall but nervous-looking young man, hesitated before nodding and stepping forward. "This way, ma'am." Eleanor took a steadying breath before walking past the gathered villagers with a calm dignity that, Miss Marple noted, seemed just a touch too practiced. As soon as she was gone, the murmurs erupted. "Imagine! Poison at the summer fete!" gasped Miss Hartnell, clutching at her pearls. "And a newcomer, no less," muttered Colonel Bantry. "Never liked her much. Too secretive by half." Miss Marple simply listened. After a moment, Inspector Graves approached, shaking his head. "I don't trust her." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "I wouldn't be too hasty, Inspector. The guilty are not always so obvious." Graves sighed. "She had access to the cake, was seen near the lemonade, and seems to be involved in some sort of legal dispute with the very man who was poisoned." "That sounds rather damning to me." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, and yet—" Graves frowned. "And yet?" Miss Marple gestured toward the refreshments table, where the untouched cakes and drinks still remained. "It is a very public place to commit a murder, don't you think?" Graves scowled. "Poison doesn't require a close encounter. It could have been slipped in hours earlier." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Then, perhaps, we should find out who had access before the fete began." Graves tapped his notebook against his palm. "You mean—" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Yes, Inspector. If Mrs. Marsh were being framed, wouldn't it be sensible to consider who might have made it seem as though she was guilty?" A new silence settled between them. Graves, ever the practical investigator, let out a reluctant sigh. "I suppose that means more questioning?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, yes, Inspector. And I do believe you will find some rather interesting answers." She turned her gaze back toward the half-eaten cake. and the spilled lemonade. Yes, she thought. The real culprit was hiding in plain sight. Chapter 4. The village green, though still dotted with remnants of the summer fete, had taken on a different atmosphere. Where there had been laughter and chatter, now there was uncertainty, and, beneath it all, fear. Inspector Graves and Constable. Reed had taken Eleanor Marsh to the station for further questioning, but Miss Jane Marple had no intention of assuming the case was solved. No, it was far too early for that. Standing near the refreshments table, she let her eyes drift over the scene of the crime, the crumbs of cake, the spilled lemonade. These were the last physical clues Mr. Symington had left behind. Dr. Haydock, who had briefly returned after checking on his patient, sighed as he joined Miss Marple. "Symington is stable," he reported. "It was poison, no doubt about it." Miss Marple nodded. "Do we know what kind?" Haydock shook his head. "Not yet. But whatever it was, it acted quickly." Miss Marple tapped her gloved fingers against her handbag. "Quick, but not instant." Haydock raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. Had the poison been truly fast-acting, Mr. Symington wouldn't have managed to walk to the hedgerow before collapsing. Haydock exhaled. So it wasn't in the first bite or sip. It took a moment to take effect. Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely." The doctor frowned. "That might mean a delayed poison, something that needed a few minutes to spread through his system." Miss Marple smiled. "Or something that he consumed in small doses before it took hold." Haydock rubbed his chin. "Are you suggesting he might have been poisoned earlier?" Miss Marple turned toward the crowd, still gathered, in small, uneasy groups across the green. "I am suggesting, dear doctor, that we must consider the entire day, not just the moment before he collapsed." Haydock gave her a measured look. "And what do you intend to do with that theory?" Miss Marple's smile was demure. "Why, ask a few questions, of course." Miss Marple drifted toward the baking stall, where Mrs. Weatherby still stood, fussing with the remnants of her cakes. Her hands twitched nervously, her earlier composure clearly shaken. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you could remind me, how long before the fete began were the cakes brought out?" Mrs. Weatherby looked up, startled. "Oh, well, we started setting up just after 11. The cakes were placed on the table at, around 11:30, I'd say." Miss Marple nodded. "And did anyone go near them before the guests arrived?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. "Well, I don't know. People were milling about. Sally Finch, the girl from the Blue Boar Inn, helped carry things. And, of course, Mrs. Marsh placed her cake down herself." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And Mr. Symington, did he come by early?" Mrs. Weatherby pursed her lips. "Now that you mention it, yes. He was here well before the raffle began. But I don't recall seeing him take anything then." "Miss," Marple hummed thoughtfully. "And who served the lemonade?" Mrs. Weatherby's face darkened with discomfort. "Mostly Sally. I suppose some people helped themselves, but she was in charge of pouring." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Thank you, dear." She turned to leave, but Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. "Miss Marple?" Miss Marple paused. "Yes?" Mrs. Weatherby's voice lowered slightly. I don't want to cause unnecessary worry, but I did see something." Miss Marple waited patiently. Mrs. Weatherby swallowed. "Just before the fete started, someone was near the cakes. I was arranging the linens, and I saw Sally Finch talking to Mr. Symington." Miss Marple's sharp mind caught hold of the detail immediately. Sally Finch. the maid from the Blue Boar Inn. The same girl who had been visibly nervous when questioned. "Did you see her give him anything?" Miss Marple asked, her tone light. Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. I think she had a cup in her hand, but I wasn't watching closely, and—" Miss Marple patted her arm. "Not to worry, dear. You've been most helpful." As she turned away, she noted that Mrs. Weatherby still looked troubled. Miss Marple, however, felt a new certainty forming. Sally Finch was standing near the refreshments table, twisting her apron in her hands. Miss Marple approached gently, her demeanor warm and unthreatening. "My dear, you must be quite exhausted after all this excitement," she said kindly. Sally jumped slightly, then gave a shaky smile. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple. It's been awful, hasn't it?" Miss Marple studied her carefully. "I dare say it must be especially awful for you, dear, considering you were one of the last people to handle the lemonade." Sally's fingers tightened around the apron. I only served what I was asked to, ma'am. I didn't do anything wrong." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course not, dear. But you did speak to Mr. Symington before the fete began, didn't you?" Sally's breath hitched. I... Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "He was a solicitor, was he not? Someone who might have had business with you, or someone close. To you?" Sally's eyes darted away. "I don't know anything about that." Miss Marple waited. Silence stretched between them. Then a single tear slipped down Sally's cheek. Miss Marple reached forward, patting her hand. There, dear. You mustn't be frightened. You didn't poison Mr. Symington." Sally's breath hitched again, and this time she nodded. No, I didn't." Miss Marple squeezed her fingers lightly. "But you know who did, don't you?" Sally's lips trembled. She swallowed. "I don't know exactly, but—" Miss Marple tilted her head. "But—" Sally closed her eyes. "I saw someone near the lemonade before the fete started. Someone who shouldn't have been there." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, but inside her mind was racing. "Who, dear?" Sally's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Symington's clerk." Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly. "Mr. Arthur Milton?" Sally nodded quickly. "Yes, he said he was looking for Mr. Symington, but I saw him near the lemonade stand, and I think he poured something into one of the cups." Miss Marple inhaled softly. Mr. Arthur Milton, Symington's trusted clerk, had hardly been mentioned before. But now, she smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear, you have just given us a very important piece of the puzzle." Sally's expression twisted, with guilt. "But what if I'm wrong?" Miss Marple's gaze was kind, but firm. "Then we must find out before it's too late." Because if Sally was right, the true culprit was still walking free. Chapter 5. The air in St. Mary Mead had taken on a peculiar tension, the kind that lingers in a village when a crime has been committed, but remains unsolved. The once lively summer fete had faded into hushed conversations and watchful glances. Jane Marple, however, was not one for idle speculation. She had long understood that in moments like these, truth hid in the small, overlooked details. And right now, the most significant detail was the name Sally Finch had whispered in confidence: Mr. Arthur Milton. As Mr. Symington's clerk, Arthur Milton had been at his employer's side for years, handling delicate legal matters, drawing up wills, and maintaining meticulous records. A man like that would have access to secrets, and more importantly, he would know exactly what his employer had been working on before the poisoning. Miss Marple, with her usual quiet decisiveness, made her way toward Much Benham Law Office, where Symington and Milton worked. It was a modest establishment, tucked between the tailor's shop and the village bank, with frosted glass windows and a small brass plaque by the door. Inside, the atmosphere was cool and clinical, the air thick, with the scent of aged paper and polished wood. The office was empty apart from Arthur Milton himself, seated behind a heavy mahogany desk, his pen moving steadily over a set of documents. At the sound of the door closing, he looked up. His face was thin and severe, his spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. "Miss Marple," he greeted politely, though his expression betrayed mild surprise. "I wasn't expecting visitors today." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, I do apologize, Mr. Milton. I hope I'm not interrupting anything too important." Arthur set his pen aside, folding his hands neatly. "Not at all. I assume this is about Mr. Symington's unfortunate incident." Miss Marple took a seat opposite him. "Yes, quite. Such a dreadful thing to happen in the middle of the fete. I dare say you must have been terribly shocked." Arthur gave a measured nod. "Of course. Mr. Symington is not just my employer. Miss Marple. He is a dear friend." Miss Marple observed him carefully. "A friend?" That was a curious word to use for a man who, by all accounts, had been a demanding and difficult solicitor. She folded her hands in her lap. "It is such a relief that he survived the poisoning. I imagine his clients would be quite distressed if he had succumbed." Arthur's expression didn't shift. "Indeed, he is a crucial figure in the community." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze casually drifting toward the neatly stacked paperwork on his desk. "My dear Mr. Milton," she said lightly, "I do wonder, was Mr. Symington working on anything particularly sensitive before the fete?" Arthur hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, with a well-practiced air of professionalism, he adjusted his spectacles. "Mr. Symington handled many cases, Miss Marple. I'm afraid I couldn't say." Miss Marple smiled, her tone gently insistent. "Oh, I quite understand. Confidentiality must be upheld. But one does hear whispers, especially in a village like this. And I do believe his latest case concerned an estate dispute." Arthur's fingers twitched. Miss Marple didn't miss it. "Now, I wouldn't dare to presume," she continued, "but I have heard mention of Mrs. Eleanor Marsh's name in relation to this matter. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Arthur's jaw tightened, just slightly. "I can't discuss client matters, Miss Marple," he said smoothly. "It would be unprofessional." Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression warm. "Oh, of course, of course. Though, you must admit, it's quite a coincidence. Mr. Symington falls ill, Mrs. Marsh is taken for questioning, and an estate case lingers unresolved." Arthur's composure wavered. He stopped himself, then sighed, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Miss Marple, I assure you, I had no involvement in what happened to Mr. Symington." Miss Marple nodded kindly. "Oh, my dear, I never said you did." Arthur's breathing had quickened, ever so slightly. Miss Marple glanced once more at the papers on his desk. "I do wonder, Mr. Milton, did Mr. Symington tell you who he was planning to rule in favor of?" Arthur went still, a long silence stretched between them. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She had found the nerve to press. Arthur swallowed. "Miss Marple, Before he could finish, the door burst open. Inspector Graves strode in, his eyes sharp. "Milton." Arthur's head snapped toward him, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear crossed his face. Graves didn't waste time. "I have reason to believe you were near the refreshments before the fete began." Arthur's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced toward Miss Marple. as though searching for a lifeline. Miss Marple, however, only folded her hands patiently. Graves took a step forward. "You were seen at the lemonade stand, Milton." Arthur, visibly tensed, Graves continued, his voice growing sharper. "And now I have a witness stating you were handling a cup before Mr. Symington even arrived at the table." Arthur's fingers curled into fists. Graves let the silence stretch. "Would you care to explain that?" Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, at last, he exhaled. "Yes," he admitted, his voice clipped. "I was there." Miss Marple tilted her head, watching him with interest. Arthur ran a shaking hand through his hair. "I didn't poison him. I swear it." "But—" He hesitated. Graves folded his arms. "But," Arthur swallowed. "I was switching the cups." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Switching them?" Arthur nodded slowly. "Yes, I had reason to believe Mr. Symington was being targeted." Graves scowled. "And you didn't think to report this?" Arthur let out a shaky laugh. "I thought I was stopping it." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "And yet, he was still poisoned." Arthur sagged in his chair. "I don't understand how. I made sure to give him the cup I had just poured myself." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with something keen and knowing. "Well now," she murmured, "that is interesting. Because if Arthur truly had switched the cups, then the poison had not been in the lemonade. It had been somewhere else entirely. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, and the true culprit was getting closer to being exposed." Chapter 6. The confession had come unexpectedly, but Miss Marple was not one to be easily misled. Arthur Milton's claim that he had switched the cups in an effort to protect Mr. Symington raised far more questions than answers. If he was telling the truth, then the poison had not been in the lemonade at all, and that meant they had been looking in the wrong place. Inspector Graves, his patience wearing thin, fixed Milton with a hard stare. "You expect me to believe you were trying to protect Symington?" Arthur sighed, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "Believe whatever you like. I saw something that made me suspicious, and I acted. I thought I had prevented it." Miss Marple, seated with her usual poise, tilted her head slightly. "And what, dear, did you see?" Arthur hesitated, then exhaled. It was Mrs. Marsh. She was standing near the refreshment table. She had just placed down the cake. And then, for just a moment, I saw her slip something out of her handbag. Inspector Graves frowned. "And you think she put something in the drink?" Arthur rubbed a hand over his face. "I thought so. That's why I switched the cups." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Yet, Mr. Symington was still poisoned." Arthur's jaw tightened. Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Which means, my dear, that whatever poison was used was never in the lemonade at all." A silence stretched between them. Then Graves muttered a curse. "The cake." Miss Marple's expression remained mild, though her sharp blue eyes were alight with something triumphant. "Yes, Inspector, the cake." They returned to Dr. Haydock's clinic, where Mr. Symington lay recovering in a dimly lit room, his breathing still weak but steady. Dr. Haydock greeted them with a tired nod. "He's improving, but it was close. Whatever he ingested, it was a highly potent dose." Inspector Graves, with his usual lack of subtlety, got straight to the point. "Haydock, we need to test the cake, now." The doctor blinked, then frowned. "The cake?" Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, my dear. We were so focused on the lemonade that we ignored the other item he consumed." Dr. Haydock nodded briskly. Then I'll have samples taken immediately." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had turned her attention to Symington himself, who had just begun to stir. "Mr. Symington, dear," she said gently, stepping closer to his bedside, "I do apologize for troubling you, but I wonder if you can tell me, what were you working on before the fete?" The solicitor blinked up at her, still disoriented, but he seemed to recognize her voice. His hand twitched slightly on the bedsheet. "Wills," he murmured. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "Yes, dear. And was there one in particular that caused tension?" A pause. Then, ever so faintly, he whispered, "The Langley estate." Inspector Graves stiffened. "Langley?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Ah," she murmured. "I rather thought so." The Langley estate had long been a quiet matter of village interest. Once a grand home, it had fallen into disrepair after the death of the last known heir. The ownership had remained in limbo, with no clear claimant, until, it seemed, Mr. Symington had found something new. Something worth killing for. Miss Marple, still thoughtful, turned to Graves. "Inspector, I do believe we ought to revisit Mrs. Marsh." Graves scowled. "She's still at the station. She's refusing to say anything useful." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Well then, I dare say we should provide her with some new information." Back at the station, Mrs. Eleanor Marsh sat in a stiff-backed chair, her face a mask of quiet dignity. She looked up as Miss Marple and Inspector Graves entered. "You again?" she murmured. "I thought I had already answered your questions." Graves crossed his arms. "You left out the most important one." Mrs. Marsh raised an eyebrow. "And what is that, Inspector?" Miss Marple, with the air of a woman discussing afternoon tea, smiled kindly. "The Langley estate, my dear." Eleanor flinched. It was small, barely perceptible, but Miss Marple had been watching for it. Graves's gaze hardened. "Mr. Symington was working on the estate case, wasn't he?" Eleanor hesitated. Then, at last, she sighed. "Yes," she admitted. "He was?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "And tell me, dear, was he planning to rule in your favor?" Mrs. Marsh's fingers clenched into fists. "No," she whispered. Graves's brows shot up. "Then, who was he ruling in favor of?" A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Mrs. Marsh exhaled shakily. "Beatrice Langley." The revelation was startling, but Miss Marple had suspected something of the sort. Beatrice Langley, a quiet, unassuming woman who had never made any claim to the estate, was the true heir, and someone had been desperate to keep that a secret. Graves ran a hand through his hair. "So, that's what this is about." Miss Marple's expression was sympathetic. "Yes, Inspector. And now the most important question remains. Who had the most to lose?" Eleanor looked down at her hands. "I was angry. I won't deny that. I wanted that estate. I thought it was mine." Miss Marple tilted her head. "But, my dear, wanting something and committing murder for it are two very different things." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "You think I did it?" Miss Marple smiled, but there was steel beneath it. "No, my dear. I think you have been used." Eleanor froze. Inspector Graves leaned forward. "By whom?" A slow realization dawned over Eleanor's face. She swallowed. "No," she whispered. It can't be." Miss Marple simply waited. And then Mrs. Marsh's expression crumpled. "My God!" she breathed. It was a sharp knock at the station door interrupted her. Constable Reed poked his head in, pale-faced. "Inspector, Dr. Haydock's here. He's confirmed it. The poison was in the cake. Miss Marple nodded calmly. Yes, she said softly. And now we know precisely who put it there. Chapter 7. The confirmation of the poisoned cake sent a fresh wave of unease through the village. Inspector Graves, usually a man of swift action, had become even more restless, pacing the small confines of his office as he tried to fit the pieces together. Mrs. Marsh, still seated stiffly across from him, seemed lost in thought, her earlier composure beginning to crumble. Miss Jane Marple, however, was the only one who appeared truly at ease. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the proceedings with a quiet, knowing expression. The poison was in the cake, Graves muttered to himself. And the cake was brought by Mrs. Marsh. Mrs. Marsh's head snapped up. I told you, I didn't put poison in it. Graves gave her a hard look. And yet, the fact remains that the cake was yours. That's not something we can ignore. Miss Marple's soft voice broke the tense silence. No, Inspector, we cannot ignore it, she agreed. But we must also ask the right questions. Graves exhaled sharply. Which are? Miss Marple tilted her head. If Mrs. Marsh did not poison the cake herself, then how did the poison get into it? Graves scowled. That's the very thing we're trying to figure out, Miss Marple. Missy. Marple gave a small, patient smile. Then we ought to consider who had access to the cake before it was served. Mrs. Marsh, who had remained silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke up, her voice shaken but resolute. I baked the cake that morning. It was in my kitchen until I brought it to the green. I left it with the others at the refreshments table. It was there for at least an hour before the fete officially began. Graves rubbed his chin. An hour. A lot could happen in that time. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And I rather think that is when the real culprit made their move. Mrs. Marsh's eyes widened slightly, as if she had only just realized what Miss Marple was implying. You mean someone tampered with it after I brought it? Miss Marple smiled gently. It would be quite foolish for someone to prepare a poisoned cake from the start, would it not? After all, you could have eaten it yourself. Graves frowned. So we're looking for someone who had access to the refreshments table before the fete started. Miss Marple nodded. And we already know of one such person. Graves's brows furrowed, but before he could speak, the door creaked open, and Constable Reed entered, looking nervous. Sir, he said hesitantly, there's something you ought to see. Miss Marple and Inspector Graves followed Reed to the evidence room, where the remnants of the cake had been collected after Dr. Haydock's analysis. It sat in a small wooden box, neatly wrapped in parchment. Beside it, another item of interest had been placed, a small, silver-handled knife. Graves frowned. What's this? Reed scratched the back of his neck. It was found among the refreshments, sir. Someone used it to cut the cakes, but he hesitated. Graves scowled. Out with it, Reed. The young constable exhaled. Dr. Haydock tested the blade. There were traces of the same poison on it. A heavy silence filled the room. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with interest. Ah, she said softly. Now that is very interesting indeed. Graves turned sharply to Reed. And who was using this knife? Reed hesitated, looking uncomfortable. Well, sir, the refreshments were mostly handled by Sally Finch. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but she noticed the way Mrs. Marsh inhaled sharply at the mention of the girl's name. Ah, yes, Miss Marple said smoothly. Sally Finch, the maid from the Blue Boar Inn. The same young woman. who was unusually nervous when questioned. Graves narrowed his eyes. "You think she did it?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. I rather think she saw something." The rain had begun to fall lightly as they made their way toward the Blue Boar Inn, where Sally Finch worked. The small public house, with its low wooden beams and cheerful flower boxes, seemed almost too ordinary a setting for murder. Inside, the air smelled of ale and roasting meat, but Sally was nowhere to be seen. "She's upstairs," said Mr. Howard, the innkeeper, a burly man with a red face. "She's been in a right state all day. I told her to get some rest." Inspector Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple before they ascended the narrow staircase, arriving at a small, modestly furnished room. Miss Marple knocked lightly. "Sally, dear." A pause. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, revealing Sally Finch, pale and trembling. Her eyes darted between them, filled with fear. "I didn't do anything," she said immediately. Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, my dear, but I believe you saw something very important." Sally bit her lip, looking away. Graves, ever impatient, folded his arms. "Enough of this. We found the knife used to cut the cake. It was poisoned. You were handling it." Sally's hands flew to her mouth. "No! I didn't put anything on it, I swear." Miss Marple took a step forward, her voice calm and reassuring. "We believe you, dear, but someone else did, and I think you know who." Sally's breathing quickened, and for a moment she looked close to tears. She swallowed hard. "I wasn't sure before, but I saw someone near the cakes, just before we started serving. Someone who shouldn't have been there." Graves leaned in. "Who?" Sally's voice shook. "Mr. Symington's clerk, Arthur Milton." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Graves cursed under his breath. "Milton again." Sally nodded frantically. "I thought it was odd, but he said he was just checking something for Mr. Symington. Then he left in a hurry." Miss Marple clasped her hands together. "And you never mentioned this before because—" Sally's face crumpled. "Because I thought I'd be blamed. I was the one serving. I was the one cutting the cakes." She looked at Miss Marple desperately. "But I didn't do it, Miss Marple. I swear." Miss Marple patted her hand. "I know, dear. I know." She turned to Graves, her expression now completely certain. "Well, Inspector," she said mildly, "I believe we are finally ready to speak to Mr. Milton properly." Graves nodded grimly. "Yes, and this time he won't be able to lie his way out of it." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Oh, indeed, because I rather think we have just caught our murderer." On Chapter 8, the storm clouds thickened over St. Mary Mead as Inspector Graves and Miss Marple made their way back toward Much Benham Law Office. Though the air was still warm from the earlier summer sun, there was a growing heaviness, a sense of something impending. Inside the solicitor's office, Arthur Milton sat at his desk, his fingers clenched tightly together. His earlier veneer of calm professionalism had started to crack. The news that poison had been found on the cake knife had sent a ripple of unease through him. And now, faced with Graves and Miss Marple once again, he looked far less assured than before. Graves wasted no time. "Mr. Milton, we now have proof that the cake was poisoned after it was placed on the refreshments table." Arthur's face remained carefully neutral, though his fingers twitched. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "And we have also discovered that you were seen near the refreshments, just before the fete began. Quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Arthur inhaled slowly. "I was there on behalf of Mr. Symington. He asked me to check something." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. And did he also ask you to handle the cake knife? Arthur froze for half a second, then forced a chuckle. I don't know what you're suggesting, but I hardly see how that would matter. Graves folded his arms. It matters because the knife had poison on it. And you, Mr. Milton, had the opportunity to use it. Arthur sat stiffly, but Miss Marple could see the slight pulse in his throat quicken. She leaned forward ever so slightly, her voice gentle. The real question, my dear Mr. Milton, is why? Why would you want Mr. Symington dead? Arthur's jaw tightened. I didn't, Miss Marple smiled politely. Oh, but you did. You see, dear, Mr. Symington was working on a rather important case, wasn't he? Arthur's shoulders stiffened. Miss Marple continued smoothly. A case concerning the Langley estate. A case in which he had recently discovered a rather unexpected claimant. Miss Beatrice Langley. Arthur's breath hitched slightly, though he quickly masked it. Miss Marple did not press him immediately. She had spent many years understanding people. She knew that sometimes silence was far more powerful than accusation. And sure enough, after a moment of tense quiet, Arthur exhaled heavily. Yes, he muttered. He was handling that case. Miss Marple nodded. And tell me, Mr. Milton, who stood to lose the most if Beatrice Langley were granted the estate? Arthur's gaze darkened. Graves, who had remained mostly silent, took a step closer. It was you, wasn't it? Arthur looked up sharply. That's absurd. Miss Marple shook her head sympathetically. Not at all, dear. You see, the Langley estate was supposed to be absorbed into the law firm's holdings, wasn't it? Arthur remained silent. Graves continued, his voice sharp. And Symington was planning to finalize the ruling in Miss Langley's favor. Arthur let out a harsh breath. And what if he was? Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. Then you, my dear Mr. Milton, were about to lose a great deal. The room felt smaller as the tension grew. The storm outside was now a steady drizzle, raindrops tapping softly against the window panes. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his expression bitter. I worked for him for years, he said finally, his voice tight. I handled every contract, every property case. And then, he scoffed. Then he decides to throw it all away for some woman who had never even set foot in the estate? Miss Marple watched him carefully. So you decided to remove the problem. Arthur laughed hollowly. I didn't intend to kill him. Graves's expression hardened. That's a poor excuse for attempted murder. Arthur exhaled. I needed time. Time to stop him from going through with it. If I had just a few more days, I could have found a way to discredit the claim. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. So you slipped poison onto the knife. Just a small amount, enough to make him ill, to delay his ruling, but not enough to kill him outright? Arthur said nothing. Graves stepped forward. That's the best story you've got, Milton? That you were only trying to make him ill? Arthur clenched his jaw. I didn't think it would be lethal. Miss Marple sighed softly. Poison is such a dangerous thing, dear. Once given, it cannot be controlled. And you must have known that. Arthur finally looked away, his hands shaking slightly. Graves nodded to Constable Reed, who stepped forward. Arthur Milton, Graves said grimly, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Harold Symington. Arthur did not fight. He simply let out a long, weary breath as he was led away. The storm had cleared by the time Miss Marple and Inspector Graves stepped back onto the cobbled streets of St. Mary Mead. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth. Graves still brooding, muttered, "I should have seen it sooner." Miss Marple patted his arm kindly. "Don't be so hard on yourself, Inspector. The best mysteries always hide in the most ordinary places." Graves exhaled sharply. "I suppose you were never fooled." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I wouldn't say that. But I did rather suspect the poison had been misplaced." Graves grumbled, but there was a small hint of admiration in his gaze. "Well, at least it's over." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Inspector. For now. Because in St. Mary Mead, secrets never remained. Buried for long." Chapter 9. The rain had passed, leaving St. Mary Mead wrapped in a damp hush. The village, though still murmuring about the day's events, had begun to settle into its usual routine of quiet scandal and hushed conversations over tea. The attempted murder of Mr. Symington had cast a shadow over the fate, but with Arthur Milton's arrest, the matter seemed, at least in part, resolved, at least to everyone except Miss Marple. Seated in her cozy sitting room, the glow of a single oil lamp casting soft shadows on the floral wallpaper, she stirred her tea slowly, her thoughts far away. Something still nagged at her. Arthur Milton's confession had been expected. He had reason, opportunity, and fear as his motivators. But Miss Marple had long since learned that people rarely acted alone in matters of crime, especially when the crime was as calculated as this one had been. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She rose, smoothing her shawl, and opened it to find Beatrice Langley standing on her doorstep. The young woman's face was drawn, her eyes dark with exhaustion. "Miss Marple," she said softly. "May I come in?" Beatrice sat at the small, round tea table, her hands wrapped tightly around a delicate china cup, as though it were the only thing anchoring her. "I don't know why I'm here," she admitted after a long silence. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, I rather think you do, my dear." Beatrice swallowed. "Arthur Milton tried to kill Mr. Symington because of me." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Yes, dear, because Mr. Symington had finally ruled in your favor." Beatrice let out a shaky breath. "I never wanted any of this." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And yet, someone did not want you to have it." Beatrice met her gaze, and something darkened in her expression. "Yes," she whispered, "that's what I'm afraid of." Miss Marple, with her years of quiet observation, had learned to listen beyond words, to hear what was left unsaid. And in Beatrice's voice, in the way her hands trembled slightly, Miss Marple sensed the weight of another truth yet to be spoken. "Tell me, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "did you ever tell anyone that you were contesting the Langley estate?" Beatrice hesitated. Then she shook her head. "No. I only found out about it when Mr. Symington called me into his office." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And yet, someone knew before you did?" Beatrice's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but pointed. "Someone acted before the ruling was even finalized. Someone who already knew that you were going to be granted the estate." Beatrice stared at her. "But that doesn't make sense. Mr. Symington didn't tell anyone. He said it was confidential until it was officially filed." Miss Marple nodded knowingly. "Yes, dear, which means the only person who could have known was someone inside his office." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, realization dawned in Beatrice's eyes. Arthur Milton wasn't working alone. Miss Marple's smile was gentle but firm. "No, my dear, I rather think he wasn't." The pieces were falling into place now. Miss Marple and Beatrice made their way toward the police station, where Inspector Graves was reviewing the case. He was still grumbling over paperwork, muttering about damned estate disputes, and how they never ended cleanly. At the sight of them, he sighed. "What now, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, just a small matter, Inspector. I do believe we have overlooked something rather important." Graves pinched the bridge of his nose. "What, precisely, have we overlooked?" Miss Marple settled into the chair across from his desk, smoothing her skirt. "Well, Inspector, we have caught Arthur Milton, have we not? A man with a clear motive, a moment of weakness, and an undeniable fear of losing something important." Graves nodded. "And?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And yet, dear Inspector, he did something rather peculiar, did he not?" Graves frowned. "You'll have to be more specific, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Why, Inspector," he confessed. Graves threw up his hands. "Yes, and?" Miss Marple smiled. "Tell me, dear, in all your experience, have you ever known a man as careful as Arthur Milton to admit to anything at all, unless he had no choice?" Graves froze, his brow furrowing. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but insistent. "And, more importantly, Inspector, why did he not attempt to place the blame elsewhere?" Graves blinked slowly. Then the truth clicked into place. "Because," he muttered, "he was covering for someone." Miss Marple nodded, pleased. "Precisely, Inspector," she said. "Arthur Milton may have placed the poison, but someone else made sure the opportunity was there for him to do so." Graves exhaled sharply. "And you think you know who?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Oh, I have my suspicions, dear, but I rather think the answer has been staring us in the face all along." As the evening deepened, Constable Reed hurried into the station, his face flushed. "Inspector," he called, slightly out of breath. "We've just received word from Dr. Haydock. He reviewed Symington's case files and found something strange." Graves narrowed his eyes. "What is it?" Reed swallowed nervously. There was a second, unsigned will in his files, one that would have transferred ownership of the Langley estate to Margaret Pritchard. The room went still. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. Inspector Graves let out a low curse. "Mrs. Pritchard?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, yes, dear Inspector. I do believe it is time we had a word with Mrs. Pritchard." Chapter 10. The evening air was crisp as Miss Marple and Inspector Graves made their way toward Pritchard House, a stately home on the edge of St. Mary Mead. The house itself was imposing, its ivy-clad stone walls bathed in the dim glow of the street lamps. It had been a place of quiet privilege for years, but now it stood at the center of a murder attempt, a crime that had nearly gone unnoticed, if not for one crucial mistake. Margaret Pritchard had been a respected figure in the Frau village for years. Widowed, wealthy, and accustomed to authority, she carried herself with the cold poise of a woman who always remained in control. But tonight, as she opened the door to find the inspector and Miss Marple standing at her threshold, her composure faltered just slightly. "Inspector," she said, her voice even, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes. "To what do I owe this late visit?" Graves didn't waste time. "We'd like to speak with you, Mrs. Pritchard, about the Langley estate." A brief pause. Then Margaret Pritchard stepped aside. "Come in, then." The sitting room was elegantly furnished, the fireplace crackling softly. Margaret poured herself a drink, but did not offer one to her guests. "I assume you've arrested Arthur Milton?" she said calmly, taking a measured sip. Graves folded his arms. Yes, he confessed to poisoning Mr. Symington. Margaret nodded as though this were an expected inconvenience, then sighed. Such an unfortunate business. Miss Marple smiled, pleasantly, taking a seat. Indeed. And yet, dear, there is something rather curious about it all. Margaret tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Oh? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, you see, Mr. Milton had a very clear reason to act. He believed that Mr. Symington was about to grant the Langley estate to Miss Beatrice Langley, and he, quite naturally, did not want that to happen. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but firm. However, my dear, the problem is, he wasn't the only one who had something to lose. Margaret's grip on her glass tightened. Inspector Graves leaned forward. We found an unsigned will, Mrs. Pritchard. One that would have granted the estate to you. Margaret stiffened. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, watching her carefully. That rather changes things, doesn't it? For the first time, a flicker of anger crossed Margaret's face. That will was never finalized. Miss Marple's smile was kind, but knowing. No, dear, because Mr. Symington had no intention of signing it. He had already made up his mind. Margaret exhaled, sharply, standing abruptly. This is absurd. Do you truly think I had anything to do with this? Graves's gaze was sharp. You had motive, Mrs. Pritchard. You were about to lose the estate. Margaret shook her head, laughing bitterly. You think I would have dirtied my hands with something so crude? Arthur Milton was desperate, yes, but I had no reason to involve myself. Miss Marple simply watched her for a long moment, then sighed. My dear, that's where you made your mistake. Because you did involve yourself. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple's gaze twinkled. Oh, but you do, dear. You see, if Arthur Milton had truly been working alone, then why did he make such an elementary mistake? Margaret froze. Graves frowned. Mistake? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, he admitted to switching the lemonade cups, thinking it was poisoned. But as we discovered, the poison was in the cake. Margaret did not move. Miss Marple's voice was calm and clear. Which means, my dear Mrs. Pritchard, someone else had to have told him to do it. A long, tense silence filled the room. Then, slowly, Margaret set her glass down. When she spoke again, her voice was cold. You truly are as perceptive as they say, Miss Marple. Graves's fingers twitched toward his cuffs. You admit it. Then? Margaret smiled faintly. Arthur was a fool. He panicked too easily. If he had just waited, we could have found a way to stop Beatrice's claim legally. But instead, he ruined everything. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Yes, dear. And so you decided to take matters into your own hands. Margaret sighed, almost regretfully. It was supposed to be simple. Just enough poison to make Symington ill, enough to delay things. I didn't expect Arthur to lose his nerve and confess. Graves pulled out his handcuffs. Margaret Pritchard, you are under arrest for conspiracy and attempted murder. Margaret smiled coolly. Oh, please, Inspector. At least allow me to finish my drink. Graves scowled. You'll have plenty of time for drinks where you're going. Margaret laughed softly, as if the entire ordeal was nothing more than an inconvenience. Then she lifted her hands, allowing the constable to cuff her. Miss Marple, watching the final act of the drama unfold, sighed quietly. The following morning, Miss Marple sat at her favorite window seat, watching the villagers as they whispered and gossiped about the arrest of Margaret Pritchard. Beatrice Langley had been granted her rightful inheritance, and Arthur Milton, though responsible, had simply been a pawn in a larger game. Miss Marple took a sip of her perfectly brewed tea and smiled. It had all unfolded just as she had suspected. As Inspector Graves entered her parlor, he shook his head. "You know, Miss Marple," he muttered, "one of these days I'd like to solve a case before you do." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, but Inspector, you do such a fine job all on your own," Graves grumbled, but there was a glint of amusement in his eyes. And with that, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, content in the knowledge that, for now, St. Mary Mead was at peace once more.